34,000 feet above the clouds, Flight 728 was only seconds away from becoming a tragedy no one would forget. A deafening explosion ripped through the left side of the aircraft, shaking the cabin so violently that coffee splashed onto tray tables, overhead bins burst open, and terrified passengers grabbed their armrests before they even understood what had happened. The smooth hum of the engines vanished, replaced by a sickening silence on one side of the jet, and an endless chorus of warning alarms inside the cockpit. Engine 1 failure. The alert flashed across every display. Beside the captain, First Officer Daniel Brooks felt his pulse spike. Years of simulator training suddenly felt painfully small compared to the reality unfolding in front of him. 236 lives now depended on every decision made in the next few minutes. Yet Captain Elena Hayes didn't panic. She didn't gasp. She didn't curse. She simply wrapped both hands around the controls, steadied the trembling aircraft, and spoke in a voice so calm it seemed impossible. "Eyes on your checklist, Daniel. We still have options." Her confidence should have been reassuring. Instead, it unsettled him, because nobody remained that calm when a fully loaded passenger jet lost an engine at cruising altitude. Then, just as the crew began working through the emergency procedures, another warning illuminated the cockpit. The remaining engine temperature was climbing. Fast. Daniel stared at the numbers as they crept higher into the red zone. "If we lose that engine," he whispered. Elena never let him finish. Her eyes scanned the instruments with frightening precision, calculating distances, altitude, fuel, winds, and possibilities faster than anyone Daniel had ever seen. Then she quietly made a decision that no commercial flight manual would ever recommend. It was a maneuver born somewhere far beyond civilian aviation. A maneuver that would later leave veteran investigators speechless. But surviving the emergency wasn't the only secret waiting in the sky. Long after the aircraft escaped disaster, 2 stealth fighter jets would appear overhead, and their pilots wouldn't call her Captain Hayes. They would greet her with a forgotten military call sign that she had buried years ago, a name that instantly revealed she had once belonged to one of the world's most elite fighter squadrons. The passengers had boarded expecting an ordinary flight. None of them realized they were about to discover who was truly sitting in the left seat. Before we begin, comment where you're watching from. If anyone had walked through Terminal C that morning, they would have remembered almost nothing about it. It was the kind of ordinary day that disappears into memory before it even ends. Rolling suitcases echoed across the polished floor. Travelers hurried toward departure gates with coffee in one hand and boarding passes in the other. A little boy chased his older sister while their exhausted parents tried to keep up. Nearby, an elderly couple studied a map, excited about celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. College students laughed over vacation plans, while business travelers typed furiously on laptops, determined to finish one last email before takeoff. For every passenger, Flight 728 was simply another trip. No one imagined it would become the most unforgettable day of their lives. Inside the cockpit, Captain Elena Hayes completed her pre-flight inspection with quiet precision. Every switch, every display, every checklist was verified without rushing. She believed discipline wasn't something you turned on during emergencies. It was a habit you practiced every single day. Across from her, First Officer Daniel Brooks admired the effortless confidence she carried. At 29, Daniel still approached every flight with the excitement of someone chasing his childhood dream. Flying beside Captain Hayes felt like attending a masterclass. She never raised her voice, never criticized unnecessarily, and somehow made even the busiest cockpit feel calm. "You ready?" Elena asked with a faint smile. Daniel grinned. Always. Outside the cockpit, Senior Flight Attendant Maya Torres welcomed passengers with the warm professionalism that had become second nature after nearly 15 years in the air. She remembered children's names, helped anxious flyers settle into their seats, joked with frequent travelers, and quietly reassured a nervous woman taking her very first flight. Within minutes, every seat was occupied. 236 strangers, 236 different stories, all trusting people they had never met. The aircraft slowly pushed back from the gate as the morning sun reflected across its silver fuselage. Ground crews waved their final signals, tug vehicles rolled away, and the massive jet began taxiing toward the runway. "Cabin secure," Maya reported. "Before takeoff checklist complete," Daniel confirmed. Everything looked perfect. The weather forecast couldn't have been better. Blue skies stretched for hundreds of miles. Winds were light. Visibility was nearly unlimited. Air traffic control cleared Flight 728 for departure without delay. As the engines roared to life, Elena guided the aircraft smoothly down the runway. Seconds later, the city shrank beneath them. Passengers relaxed. Seatbelt signs eventually switched off. Conversations filled the cabin. Children pressed their faces against the windows, amazed by the blanket of white clouds below. It felt like the definition of an uneventful flight, exactly the kind Elena preferred. She had spent years making sure her past stayed exactly where it belonged, in another life, under another uniform, with another name. No medals decorated her office. No photographs revealed where she had been. No one at the airline knew why certain situations never seemed to rattle her. To everyone around her, she was simply a dependable airline captain who loved flying and avoided attention. She intended to keep it that way. But somewhere beyond the horizon, fate had already begun writing a very different ending for Flight 728. Within the next hour, the peaceful silence inside that cockpit would be shattered, and the secret Elena had buried for years would have nowhere left to hide. As Flight 728 cruised peacefully above a sea of brilliant white clouds, the passengers settled into the comforting rhythm of air travel. Some watched movies. Some drifted to sleep. Others stared through the windows, unaware that the woman guiding the aircraft had spent years flying in skies, where every mission carried the possibility of never coming home. Long before Captain Elena Hayes wore an airline uniform, she had lived a completely different life. Back then, the sky wasn't a place people admired. It was a battlefield. Fresh out of aviation school, Elena had joined the military with one simple goal: to become the best pilot she could possibly be. The training quickly taught her that talent alone meant nothing. Every day pushed her beyond exhaustion. Endless hours in simulators, punishing physical drills, split-second decision exercises, and high-speed flights forced young pilots to prove they could stay calm when everything around them fell apart. Many quit. Some failed. Elena never did. Her instructors noticed something unusual about her. While others reacted to emergencies with adrenaline, she reacted with clarity. She didn't ignore fear. She simply refused to let it make decisions for her. That mindset earned her an invitation into one of the military's most demanding advanced tactical flight programs, where only the finest aviators were selected. There, every lesson came with impossible odds. Aircraft closed on each other at incredible speeds. Exercises demanded decisions in fractions of a second. One mistake could mean simulated defeat, or far worse during real operations. It was during those years that Elena earned the call sign Falcon, not because she was aggressive, but because she saw opportunities long before anyone else did. Her fellow pilots often joked that while everyone else searched for a safe way out, Falcon had already found three. The nickname followed her through countless overseas deployments and classified operations. She flew missions that rarely appeared in newspapers and accomplished assignments she could never discuss outside secured briefing rooms. Some days ended with celebration. Others ended with empty seats at the debriefing table. Those losses stayed with her far longer than any medal ever could. Eventually, Elena realized something she had never expected. She no longer dreamed about glory. She dreamed about peace. She wanted mornings that didn't begin with emergency alerts. She wanted to fly because she loved flying, not because someone else's life depended on a mission. Leaving the military wasn't easy, but it was necessary. When she applied to commercial aviation, she deliberately simplified her resume. She listed thousands of flight hours, but omitted the stories behind them. Awards stayed packed away in storage boxes. Her military photographs remained locked in a drawer that hadn't been opened for years. She wasn't ashamed of her past. She simply didn't want to live inside it anymore. To her new coworkers, Elena Hayes was just another experienced airline captain, quiet, dependable, and remarkably composed. No one asked many questions. No one recognized the woman once known as Falcon. And that was exactly how she wanted it, because she believed that chapter of her life had finally ended. High above the clouds, with passengers laughing, reading, and enjoying an ordinary flight, it certainly felt that way. The sky, however, had other plans. Within minutes, everything Elena had spent years leaving behind would come rushing back, faster than anyone on board could possibly imagine. For nearly an hour, Flight 728 floated effortlessly through the afternoon sky. The aircraft had settled into that peaceful phase of a journey when time seemed to slow. The steady hum of the engines became background noise, and confidence quietly filled the cabin. Seatbelt signs were off, window shades were half open, and sunlight spilled across rows of smiling faces. Maya Torres and her cabin crew moved gracefully down the aisles with drink carts, exchanging friendly conversations with passengers. A little girl proudly showed Maya a sketchbook filled with drawings of airplanes, insisting that one day she would fly one herself. Across the aisle, an elderly man smiled as he looked through old family photographs on his phone, preparing to surprise his granddaughter on her birthday. Several rows behind him, a newly married couple planned their honeymoon, laughing over places they hoped to visit. Life felt wonderfully ordinary. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was just as relaxed. Daniel reviewed weather updates while Elena quietly monitored the instruments. Every display showed exactly what every pilot hopes to see: stable altitude, balanced fuel consumption, and smooth engine performance. "Looks like we'll be arriving a little early," Daniel said with a grin. Elena nodded without taking her eyes off the flight displays. The easiest flights are usually the ones that remind you not to get comfortable. Daniel smiled politely, assuming it was simply another lesson from an experienced captain. He had no idea how often those words had kept Elena alive. Then, boom! A violent explosion slammed through the aircraft like a giant invisible hammer. The entire jet lurched sideways. Passengers screamed as drinks exploded into the air, laptops crashed onto the floor, and several overhead compartments burst open, sending bags tumbling into the aisle. The peaceful hum of two engines instantly changed into an uneven roar that every pilot fears hearing. Inside the cockpit, piercing alarms erupted all at once. Red warning lights flooded the instrument panel. "Engine 1 failure." Daniel's heartbeat seemed to stop. His hands froze for a split second before years of training forced them back to the emergency checklist. "Engine 1 just dropped offline," he shouted. "I see it," Elena answered, her voice remarkably steady. There was no panic, no hesitation, only action. Her left hand steadied the controls while her right transmitted an emergency call to air traffic control. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. Flight 728 declaring an emergency. We have suffered a left engine failure. Request immediate vectors to the nearest suitable airport." The controller responded instantly, his normally calm voice carrying unmistakable urgency. "Flight 728, radar contact confirmed. Turn right heading 085. Stand by for diversion instructions." Daniel rapidly read each emergency procedure aloud while Elena completed every action with calm precision. Watching her work felt almost unreal. She wasn't simply following a checklist. She seemed to anticipate each problem before it appeared. Outside the cockpit, Maya felt the aircraft settle into an unfamiliar bank. She picked up the interphone. "Captain, the passengers know something's wrong. What should I tell them?" Without looking away from the instruments, Elena replied, "Tell them we've experienced a mechanical problem. Ask everyone to remain seated and trust the crew." Maya could hear confidence in Elena's voice, but after years of flying, she also recognized something else. This wasn't over. Moments later, Elena's eyes locked onto another display. A number was climbing, slowly, relentlessly. The temperature of the only remaining engine had begun creeping higher than it should. At first, it was only a few degrees, then 10, then 20. Daniel followed her gaze, and the color drained from his face. If that engine overheats... He couldn't finish the sentence. Neither of them needed to. The aircraft had survived losing one engine. Now the second was beginning to fail. And 34,000 feet above the Earth, the margin between survival and catastrophe had suddenly become terrifyingly thin. The cockpit suddenly felt much smaller. Not because the walls had moved, but because every second now carried the weight of 236 lives. The warning tone echoed again. Beep, beep, beep. The temperature indicator for the remaining engine continued climbing, inching closer to the red zone with stubborn determination. Elena watched the numbers without blinking. She had seen machines fail before. What frightened pilots wasn't a sudden disaster. It was watching one slowly unfold while knowing there was almost nothing left to stop it. Daniel quickly pulled up nearby airports on the navigation display. "We've got Ridgeview International," he said, tracing the route with his finger. "Longest runway in the region. Full emergency services." Elena did the math almost instantly. Distance, altitude, aircraft weight, wind, single-engine performance, fuel. Every calculation pointed to the same painful conclusion. "We're not going to make Ridgeview." Daniel stared at her. There has to be another way. She wished there were. Air traffic control broke the silence. "Flight 728, emergency crews are standing by at Ridgeview. Advise if you're able to continue." Elena pressed the transmit button. "Negative. Our remaining engine is overheating. We may not have that much time." For several long seconds, no one spoke. The only sounds inside the cockpit were alarms, controlled breathing, and the steady vibration of an aircraft fighting to stay in the sky. Then the engine temperature climbed another few degrees. Daniel swallowed hard. "If we keep this power setting, we'll cook the engine." "And if we reduce power," Elena answered quietly, "we lose speed. And we lose altitude." It was an impossible choice: destroy the engine, or slowly surrender the sky. She reached for the thrust lever. Without hesitation, she eased it back. The change was immediate. The screaming temperature slowed its climb, but the aircraft responded with a gentle, sickening sink. Altitude began disappearing. 34,000 feet, 33,700, 33,300. Every few seconds, another 100 feet vanished. Gravity had entered the conversation. Back in the cabin, passengers could now feel the difference. The airplane no longer floated smoothly. It seemed to settle lower, almost as if an invisible hand were slowly pulling it toward the earth. Conversation stopped. People exchanged nervous glances. Several passengers looked out the windows, searching for answers hidden among endless clouds. Maya walked calmly through the aisle despite the fear tightening inside her chest. She reassured an elderly woman whose hands wouldn't stop shaking. She helped a frightened child fasten his seatbelt again. She smiled at everyone. It wasn't because she wasn't scared. It was because fear spreads faster than fire inside an airplane. Near the back of the cabin, a young father quietly recorded a short video on his phone. "If anything happens," he whispered, struggling to smile into the camera, "I love you both more than anything." Across the aisle, another passenger closed her laptop, folded her hands together, and silently began to pray. The atmosphere had changed. People didn't know exactly what was wrong, but instinct told them this wasn't ordinary turbulence anymore. Inside the cockpit, Daniel stared at the navigation display. Airport after airport slipped beyond reach. Every passing mile closed another door. Air traffic control returned with another update. "Flight 728, we're searching for additional landing options. Stand by." Elena looked through the windshield at the endless horizon. Blue sky, white clouds. Not a single runway in sight. For the first time since the emergency began, she stopped thinking like an airline captain. Deep inside, a part of her she had buried years ago quietly awakened. The disciplined fighter pilot who survived impossible situations wasn't asking what the rulebook recommended. She was asking one question: what gives these people the best chance to go home? The answer arrived almost instantly. It was risky, unconventional, and if it failed, investigators would spend years debating why she ever attempted it. Elena wrapped her hand around the control column, took one slow breath, and made her decision. "Daniel," she said, her voice calm enough to silence every alarm in the cockpit, "we're done flying by the book." And before he could ask what she meant, her hand moved toward the controls. Wind direction. Distance to every possible runway. There was only one path that offered even a slim chance of success. "Stay with me," she said calmly. "This is going to feel wrong before it feels right." Without another word, Elena gently lowered the nose of the aircraft. At first the movement was subtle, then it became unmistakable. The horizon climbed higher across the windshield as the massive jet entered a deliberate descent. Inside the cabin, hundreds of stomachs seemed to rise at once. A wave of startled gasps swept through the passengers. Plastic cups slid across tray tables. Loose magazines drifted onto the floor. Several people instinctively grabbed the armrests as the aircraft picked up speed. Daniel stared at the airspeed indicator. "We're descending." "I know. We're losing altitude." "We're buying something more valuable." He looked at her confused. "Energy." She pointed toward the flight display without taking her eyes off the sky. "A heavy aircraft with limited thrust can't simply wish itself farther. We need momentum. More speed creates more usable lift, and more lift stretches our glide." Right now, altitude sitting in the sky isn't helping anyone. We have to convert it into distance. As the aircraft accelerated, Elena made tiny, almost invisible control inputs. Every movement was measured. Every correction happened before the airplane even seemed to need it. Daniel watched the navigation screen in disbelief. The aircraft's projected range was slowly increasing. The impossible idea was actually working. "You've done this before," he murmured. Elena didn't answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed beyond the windshield. But for a brief moment, memories flashed through her mind. Night skies, carrier decks surrounded by dark ocean, violent crosswinds, instructors demanding perfection, landings where hesitation meant disaster. Those years had taught her that panic wastes time, and time is the one thing emergencies never give back. Back in the cabin, fear was spreading much faster than reassurance. A baby cried uncontrollably. Someone shouted, "What's happening?" A flight attendant helped an elderly passenger tighten her seatbelt, while another quietly comforted a young boy who had buried his face against his mother's shoulder. Near the rear of the aircraft, a woman wiped tears from her eyes before dialing her husband's number. The call didn't connect. She tried again, and again. Maya felt the tension building with every passing second. She picked up the interphone. "Captain, people are terrified." Elena reached for the public address microphone. The cabin instantly fell silent as her voice filled the aircraft. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Hayes speaking." She paused, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted every passenger to hear what came next. "We've experienced a serious mechanical failure. My crew and I are fully focused on bringing you safely to the ground. I need everyone to remain seated, keep your seatbelts securely fastened, and follow every instruction from our flight attendants. Your cooperation gives us the best possible chance of a safe landing." There was no forced optimism, no empty promises, just calm honesty. And strangely, that honesty steadied the cabin. Passengers still looked frightened, but panic slowly gave way to trust. At that very moment, air traffic control broke in with urgent news. "Flight 728, we've identified another airport. It's much closer than Ridgeview, a regional field with emergency services already moving into position." Daniel quickly reviewed the airport information. His heart sank. The runway's barely 6,000 feet. For an aircraft this size under these conditions, it was dangerously short. Most captains would reject it without hesitation. Elena didn't. "Give us the heading," she replied. She banked the aircraft toward the tiny airport, her movements smooth and decisive. Daniel looked at her, searching for hesitation. There wasn't any. Only absolute commitment. Because Elena wasn't aiming for the perfect runway anymore. She was aiming for the only runway that still offered hope. And from this moment forward, every mile they flew would determine whether 236 people walked away or became tomorrow's headlines. The regional airport finally appeared on the horizon. From 30,000 feet it looked insignificant. A thin strip of gray surrounded by open fields, barely visible against the landscape. To most pilots, it was simply another airport on a map. To Captain Elena Hayes, it was the last chance to bring 236 people home. Daniel zoomed in on the navigation display, hoping the runway would somehow become longer. It didn't. "Runway length confirmed," he said quietly. 6,000 feet. He looked out the windshield, then back at the instruments. "That's not much room." "No," Elena replied. "It isn't." There was no fear in her voice, only acceptance. Air traffic control cleared every aircraft from the area. Ground vehicles raced alongside the runway, and flashing emergency lights painted streaks of red and blue across the pavement. Firefighters, paramedics, and rescue crews lined up in silence, all staring toward the approaching aircraft. Everyone understood the odds. Inside the cockpit, Elena's world had narrowed to numbers. Altitude, airspeed, rate of descent, wind correction, distance remaining. Nothing else existed. "Gear down." Daniel lowered the landing gear. A heavy thump echoed beneath the aircraft. Almost instantly, the jet resisted the airflow. The extra drag pulled at the airplane like an invisible hand trying to slow it too early. "Airspeed dropping." "I've got it." Elena added just enough thrust to hold their target speed, careful not to overwork the overheating engine. Every movement demanded a compromise. Too much power, The engine might fail completely. Too little. The aircraft could stall before reaching the runway. There was no room for mistakes. Flaps 15. The wing surfaces extended. The aircraft settled again. Its controls became more responsive, but the drag increased even further. Daniel read each checklist item with measured precision, though his heartbeat was so loud he could barely hear his own voice. Outside, crosswinds suddenly swept across the approach path. The jet drifted sideways. Passengers felt the movement immediately. A ripple of frightened whispers spread through the cabin. Maya stood securely strapped into her jump seat, facing the rows of anxious faces she had spent the past hour trying to comfort. She could see parents gripping their children's hands. She saw strangers reaching across aisles to encourage one another. An elderly couple quietly leaned their heads together, eyes closed, saying nothing at all. The aircraft shuddered again. A woman whispered, "Please." No one knew whether she was speaking to the crew or to God. Back in the cockpit, Daniel called out the descent. 3,000 feet. Stable. 2,000. Correcting. The runway grew larger. Far too quickly. Elena made another tiny adjustment, then another. Each movement was so small Daniel barely noticed them, yet every correction placed the aircraft exactly where it needed to be. Watching her fly was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Most pilots chased the runway. Elena seemed to predict where it would be seconds before the airplane arrived. Another gust struck the aircraft. The wings rocked. Daniel instinctively tightened his grip. Elena barely moved. She had already anticipated it. Her hands remained steady, guiding the aircraft with quiet confidence born from years of experience few people knew she possessed. Outside, the emergency crews watched in silence. Even from the ground, they could tell something extraordinary was happening. The approach wasn't dramatic. It wasn't reckless. It was unbelievably precise. Every foot of altitude, every knot of speed, every correction served one purpose: touch down on a single exact point. Not 50 feet beyond it, not 20 feet short. One point, one opportunity. Daniel finally understood why her flying felt so different. She wasn't aiming to land. She was aiming to arrive at one precise spot, as if every inch beyond it simply didn't exist. The runway rapidly filled the windshield. Warning alarms continued echoing through the cockpit. The remaining engine trembled under the strain. The wind shifted once more. 500 feet, Daniel called, his voice barely above a whisper. Neither pilot spoke again. There was nothing left to discuss. Only one chance remained, and it was rushing toward them faster than either of them could stop. The runway filled the windshield until it seemed to erase everything else. There was no sky, no city, no distractions, only a narrow ribbon of asphalt racing toward Flight 728. Inside the cockpit, every warning alarm blended into a single relentless sound. But Elena no longer noticed it. Her entire focus rested on one invisible mark near the beginning of the runway, the exact place where the aircraft had to touch down. Not close, exactly there. Daniel's voice broke the silence. 400 feet. Elena made the slightest correction. The nose aligned perfectly with the center line. Another gust of wind pushed against the right wing, trying to force the aircraft off course. She answered with a smooth input that looked almost effortless. The jet obeyed. 300. The overheating engine groaned under the final demands placed upon it. 200. Passengers gripped their armrests so tightly their knuckles turned white. Some squeezed their eyes shut, others refused to blink, watching the ground rise toward them through the windows. Maya remained strapped into her jump seat, silently repeating the emergency procedures she had practiced hundreds of times, hoping today they would be enough. 100. The runway lights flashed beneath the cockpit. 50. Elena gently eased back on the controls. 40. Everything slowed. At least it felt that way. Then, bang! The main landing gear slammed into the pavement with a violent jolt that shook the entire aircraft. Gasps and screams erupted throughout the cabin. Before the tires had fully settled, Elena deployed the spoilers. The wings dumped their lift instantly. Reverse thrust! Daniel reacted immediately. The remaining engine roared one final time as reverse thrust engaged. Brakes. Maximum pressure. The aircraft shuddered violently. For several seconds, it felt as though the jet was finally beginning to slow. Then Daniel looked ahead. His stomach dropped. The runway end markers were approaching far too quickly. "We're still too fast." He checked the speed, still dangerously high. The distance remaining disappeared with terrifying speed. 4,000 feet, 3,000, 2,000. The numbers were running out. So was the pavement. Elena didn't waste a second hoping for a miracle. "Fuel dump." Daniel stared at her. "Now!" He activated the emergency fuel dump system. Thousands of pounds of fuel streamed harmlessly behind the aircraft, reducing weight as quickly as possible. The speed dropped, but not enough. The runway end rushed toward them like a wall. Daniel's breathing became uneven. "We're not going to stop." Elena already knew. She had accepted that possibility long before the wheels touched the ground. Her eyes darted beyond the pavement. To the left stretched a broad strip of rain-softened grass leading into open ground. Most pilots would fight desperately to remain on the runway. Elena saw something different. She saw friction. She saw resistance. She saw one final chance. Without hesitation, she turned the control wheel. The aircraft gently left the center line. "What are you doing?" Daniel shouted. "Saving the airplane." The left main gear rolled off the pavement. A heartbeat later, the entire aircraft plunged into the soft ground beside the runway. The impact was brutal. Mud, dirt, and grass exploded around the landing gear. The cabin shook with violent force. Overhead bins burst open completely, sending bags crashing into the aisle. Passengers cried out as their seatbelts locked tight across their chests. The nose swung sharply. For one terrifying moment, it felt as though the aircraft might tip onto one wing. "Hold it! Hold it!" Daniel whispered. Elena fought the controls with calm determination. Tiny corrections. No sudden movements. She refused to let panic make the final decision. The earth itself seemed to grab the aircraft. Every yard through the muddy ground tore away more speed. 100 knots. 80. 60. 40. The shaking slowly eased. 20 knots. 10. Finally, silence. The massive jet rolled only a few more feet before coming to a complete stop. No alarms, no movement, only stunned disbelief. For several endless seconds, nobody spoke. Then a child began crying. Someone laughed through tears. Another passenger whispered, "We're alive." The words spread through the cabin like a wave. "We're alive. We actually made it." Daniel slowly released the controls, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He looked through the windshield at the runway they had barely escaped. Then he turned toward Elena. She remained perfectly still, both hands resting on the controls, her breathing calm but heavy. Daniel searched for words that made sense. None did. Finally, almost in a whisper, he asked the only question left. "Captain, who taught you to fly like that?" Elena looked out at the quiet airfield, where flashing emergency vehicles were already racing toward them. A faint, distant smile crossed her face. "You don't learn landings like that in commercial aviation," she said softly. "And something tells me our story isn't over yet." For several long moments after the aircraft stopped, no one moved. It was as if time itself had frozen. The cabin, which had been filled with screams only seconds earlier, fell into an almost unbelievable silence. Hundreds of people simply stared ahead, trying to understand what had just happened. Then a little voice broke the stillness. "Mom, are we okay?" The child's mother wrapped both arms around him and burst into tears. That single moment shattered the silence. Across the cabin, sobs echoed from every direction. Strangers embraced one another without exchanging names. Some laughed through tears. Others buried their faces in their hands, overwhelmed by the realization that they were still alive. Maya unfastened her harness and took one deep breath before standing. Her legs felt unsteady, but her training took over. She picked up the interphone. "Cabin crew, begin evacuation procedures. Stay calm. Check outside conditions before opening exits." Within seconds, inflatable slides deployed, emergency exits opened, and passengers began leaving the aircraft in an orderly stream. Outside, firefighters rushed toward the jet while paramedics waited at the bottom of each slide. Airport workers guided frightened passengers away from the aircraft, counting every person as they reached safety. Inside the cockpit, Daniel finally allowed himself to lean back in his seat. His shirt was soaked with sweat. He hadn't realized how tightly he had been gripping the controls until his fingers refused to fully open. He looked toward Elena. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't smiling. She was still scanning every flight display, confirming there was no fire, no fuel leak threatening the cabin, no hidden danger waiting to appear. Only after the final warning light disappeared did she slowly remove her headset. "All passengers accounted for," Maya reported through the cockpit door, her voice trembling with relief. Elena closed her eyes for one brief second. Good. Nothing more. Just one quiet word carrying the weight of 236 saved lives. Then, the radio crackled. It wasn't air traffic control. It wasn't the airport tower. The voice that filled the cockpit carried the confident tone of someone accustomed to flying much faster than airliners. "Commercial Flight 728, this is Guardian 1, do you copy?" Daniel frowned. He checked the radio frequency. "Who is that?" Elena's expression changed almost imperceptibly. She recognized the cadence before she recognized the words. "This is Flight 728, she replied. "We read you." A brief pause followed. Then another voice joined the transmission. "Captain, that was some remarkable flying." Daniel exchanged a confused glance with Elena. The first voice continued. "We've been shadowing your emergency approach since you declared the engine failure." Daniel's eyes widened. "Shadowing us?" He looked through the windshield. High above the airport, two sleek fighter jets circled gracefully beneath the afternoon sun. They hadn't noticed them before. Now they were impossible to miss. The pilot spoke again, sounding almost amused. "We recognized your control inputs long before we recognized your aircraft." Elena remained silent. Her fingers tightened slightly around the microphone. The radio crackled once more. "No airline captain flies an approach quite like that." A longer pause. Then came the sentence that left the cockpit speechless. "Permission to ask a question." The pilot didn't wait for an answer. "Is this really Falcon?" Daniel slowly turned toward Elena. His heart pounded louder than any warning alarm had. Falcon? The name meant nothing to him, but the way Elena closed her eyes for a single moment told him it meant everything to her. She had spent years building a quiet life, years making sure no one connected Captain Elena Hayes with the decorated military aviator she used to be. She had buried that identity beneath routine airline schedules, ordinary uniforms, and peaceful skies. Today, the sky had uncovered it. Elena pressed the transmit button one final time. Her voice carried neither pride nor regret, only acceptance. "Yes," she answered softly. "This is Falcon." For several seconds, the frequency remained silent. Then both fighter pilots responded together. "It's an honor to fly beside you again, ma'am." At that exact moment, the two jets climbed into perfect formation above the airport before slowly dipping their wings in a graceful salute. Passengers standing safely on the tarmac looked up in amazement. Whispers spread through the crowd. "Who are they saluting? Who is Falcon?" One by one, curious eyes turned toward the woman quietly stepping out of the cockpit. Not toward a celebrity, not toward a war hero, but toward the captain who had refused to let fear write the ending of their story. Only then did every passenger realize they hadn't simply been flown home by an experienced airline pilot. They had been rescued by someone whose greatest mission had remained a secret, until the sky chose to tell it. The days that followed felt strangely quiet. For Captain Elena Hayes, the hardest part wasn't surviving the emergency. It was returning to an ordinary life after the world refused to let it be ordinary. Investigators confirmed what the crew already knew. The left engine had suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure, and the remaining engine had been only minutes away from shutting down completely. Aviation experts studied every second of the flight, replaying cockpit recordings and flight data over and over again. Again and again they reached the same conclusion. Without Elena's split-second decisions, Flight 728 would never have reached the ground. News channels couldn't stop talking about the mysterious airline captain whose hidden military past had surfaced during one of the most remarkable emergency landings in recent memory. Passengers shared emotional interviews, describing the terrifying moments they believed they would never see their families again. But every time a reporter placed a microphone in front of Elena, her answer never changed. "I wasn't alone." She always mentioned Daniel. She always praised Maya and the cabin crew for keeping panic under control. She always thanked the passengers for trusting the crew during the worst moments of their lives. "The safest cockpit is never built by one person," she often said. "It's built by people who trust each other when fear is loudest." Weeks later, Elena stood inside a large ceremony hall filled with aviation officials, rescue personnel, and many of the passengers whose lives had crossed hers for just a few unforgettable hours. As her name was announced, the audience rose to its feet. The applause continued long after she reached the stage. Yet the moment that touched her most wasn't receiving another medal. It came when she looked into the audience and recognized familiar faces. The elderly couple celebrating their anniversary, the young father who had recorded a goodbye message, the nervous woman taking her very first flight, and the little girl with the sketchbook. She waited patiently until the ceremony ended before walking toward Elena, holding the same notebook she had carried onto Flight 728. This time, a new drawing filled the page. Instead of simply sketching an airplane, she had drawn a woman standing proudly beside it. Across the top, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "Captain Falcon." The little girl smiled shyly. "I want to fly someday." Elena knelt so they were eye to eye. "Then don't chase being fearless," she said gently. "Learn, practice, ask questions, make mistakes while you're training. Confidence doesn't appear during emergencies. It grows long before they happen." The girl nodded, holding every word as if it were a treasure. Months became years. The headlines slowly disappeared. The television interviews stopped. Public attention moved on to newer stories, just as it always does. Elena preferred it that way. Instead of chasing fame, she accepted an invitation to help redesign emergency flight training for commercial pilots. Drawing from years of military experience, she introduced practical decision-making exercises focused on staying calm when standard procedures alone weren't enough. She believed the greatest victory wasn't being remembered. It was helping another crew save lives she would never even meet. One quiet afternoon several years later, a handwritten envelope arrived at her home. Inside was a photograph. The little girl from Flight 728, now a young woman, stood proudly beside a small training aircraft, wearing a student pilot's uniform. On the back of the photo was a handwritten message. "Dear Captain Hayes, you probably don't remember me. I was the little girl who drew airplanes on your flight. Next week I'll be flying one for the first time. That day taught me something I'll never forget. Real courage isn't the absence of fear. It's staying calm when everyone else needs hope. Thank you for giving me both my future and my dream." Elena read the letter twice before quietly placing it beside the window. Outside, another airliner traced a white line across the blue sky. She smiled. Saving 236 people had become the story the world remembered. Inspiring even one of them to reach for the sky became the story she treasured most. Because in the end, the greatest legacy of a pilot isn't measured by the miles they fly. It's measured by the lives they lift along the way. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes courage begins with preparation. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.